Chris Schaefer. I'm the university librarian here at UCSF. And as I said just a minute ago, I've been here for about 5 years. And one of the main draws for me to come here is the leadership that UCSF and the University of California have demonstrated for many years that has on the areas of open access and open science and transforming scholarly communication. And I just want to say that in my 5 years here, we have come so much farther and succeeded in so many things that I would have never thought possible when I came here. But the reason I came here is to be part of this change and all the exciting work that we're doing. We're going to celebrate the past 10 years of the open access policy here, but I want to say that we are actively working in this area and continue to work in this area and expect to do many more wonderful things in the next 10 years. So it's been a great 10 years, looking forward to the next 10 years, and let's go ahead and change the world. And with that, I'll hand it over to Annalisa, who's going to give an overview of the history of the policy and activities here at UCSF.
All right, thank you, Chris. So I'm Annalisa Taylor. I'm the head of scholarly communication with UCSF Library. So before we bring all the panelists up to the front, we're going to just give a brief overview of what the open access policy is and then different types of open access publishing that we're talking about today. So the UCSF Open Access Policy was passed by the UCSF Academic Senate in May of 2012. So we're celebrating that 10-year anniversary today. The policy allows faculty to share their scholarly articles freely online with anybody anywhere in the world. When you publish your work open access, that means it's making it free for anybody to access it, to read it, to use it, to reuse it. And they don't have to have a subscription to access that content. They don't have to encounter any kind of other paywall. So if you're not a faculty member and you're wondering, well, how does this affect me? The good news is that there's another policy, open access policy, that affects all other employees at the University of California. This is a UC-wide policy, and it's because there's a different governance structure for faculty and other employees, it's a presidential open access policy. So these collectively, we refer to these policies as the UC open access policies. And what this means is that any employee at the University of California can exercise the rights that these policies provide. Basically, what these policies allow you to do is to share your work on an open access repository such as eScholarship. This is the UC open access publishing platform. And you don't have to pay anything to the publisher. There's no cost to exercise this kind of open access. This is typically referred to as green open access, or you might see it as self-archiving. And the version that you deposit under this policy, or that the policy protects your use of, is your final author accepted manuscript, or the AAM. A little bit more detail about that version. So when you're practicing green open access, you're typically using the author accepted manuscript, the AAM, as I mentioned. What this is your version of your manuscript that's been submitted to a journal for publication. It's been accepted for publication, gone through the peer review, and it has the peer review changes integrated. But it's the version of that manuscript before the publisher then typesets it and copy edits it. When you're doing green open access, you're typically not using the publisher's final PDF. Publishers really don't like it when you use their version of their file and put it on an open access repository. There's only a handful of publishers that will allow the use of that version of your paper. So just make the assumption when you're practicing the open access policies, this is the version that we're talking about. So when it comes to open access publishing, there's really two main routes or two main ways to achieve open access. We've been talking about green open access, which is open access policies. So depositing an eScholarship as one example, the UC Open Access Repository. Also, if you're an NIH researcher and you're making your works available in the NIH repository, which is PubMed Central, that's also a green open access policy. Also, if you publish preprints, so the version of your manuscripts before they go through the peer review, that's also considered green open access. The other version of open access is gold open access, and it might be the version that more people are familiar with. This is when you're publishing on the publisher's platform. So if you're publishing in a journal like PLOS One or any of the Frontiers journals, or Cell Reports, which is an open access journal from a publisher that has both subscription and open access journals, or if you're publishing in a subscription journal that has the option to publish your individual article open access, that's considered gold open access. And there's often a fee that's associated with that that's charged to the author when their article is accepted. Now, there's another version of open access that's called Diamond Open Access, and it's really a form of Gold Open Access. But with Gold Open Access, the difference is that there's no cost to the author to publish their works open access on the publisher's platform. So a good example of that is also eScholarship, our UC Open Access publishing platform, and you're going to hear more about that from one of our panelists. eScholarship publishes 95 open access journals, and there's no fees to authors to publish there. Another good example of that is the publisher annual reviews. There's the open access is paid for through library subscriptions. And so through library subscriptions, they open up the content to all readers, so authors don't have to pay. So the UC libraries and the UC system are really pursuing all of these routes of open access. We have the UC open access policies. We're increasingly signing open access agreements with publishers, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that today as well. And we're also supporting these Diamond OA initiatives like eScholarship, annual reviews, Open Library of Humanities. So with that background, and if you have any more questions about this, please feel free to raise your hand if you're here in the audience, or if you're on Zoom, you can always submit your questions through the chat window. I am now going to hand it over to Dr. Sijong Lee. She's going to introduce today's panelists and as well as our moderator. Dr. Lee is an associate professor of community health systems in the School of Nursing. She's also the chair of the Academic Senate Committee on Library and Scholarly Communication. So Dr. Lee.
So this is a great honor, and also it's my pleasure to introduce today's three panelists. Dr. Richie Schneider is a professor of orthopedic surgery at UCSF. For more than 18 years, Dr. Schneider has been engaged in issues related to scholarly communication, academic publishing, and open access. And he served as chairs of both the UCSF and also the UC system-wide committees on library and scholarly communications many years. And he led the efforts to create and pass the open access policy for UCSF as well as the system-wide. He also has been serving on the UC team that is negotiating transformative open access agreements with publishers. And I think many people know about the Elsevier negotiation. And then the second panelist, Dr. Marta Margetta, she is a professor of pathology at UCSF. She also has been a passionate advocate for open access and also scholarly communications. And she also served as a chair of both UCSF and also UC system-wide committees on library and scholarly communications. And she also has been a member of the team that negotiating open access agreement with publishers. And the third panelist, Dr. Catherine Mitchell, she is the director of the California Digital Libraries Publishing, Archives, and Digitization Program. She is also the principal investigator for the next generation library publishing initiatives. So she has been playing an important role in implementing the OA the policy, and she serves as the operation director of the UC's Office of Scholarly Communication. I also want to introduce Dr. Robin Corelli. She will moderate the active discussion with the panelists today. Dr. Corelli is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Clinical Pharmacy. And also she is Associate Dean of Faculty Academic Affairs in the School of Pharmacy. And she was the member of the COLASC last year, and she also an important member to prepare for today's event. Thank you. And so panelists can come up and
All right, this is gonna our plan this party basically since January. We're excited to have it all come together. This is going to be a panel discussion. We want this to be semi-informal.
I start.
Is this
Okay.
there we go.
Okay. A little bit closer.
I think if you just do the far, it should, yeah, there we go.
Okay. Can you see well?
We can see, but I'm not sure we can hear.
I think once you'll be able to hear with the room microphones.
Okay.
Can you all,
Igor, can you hear now?
Barely.
Barely.
okay, well, we have these.
Thank you, Robin.
All right, how about now?
We tested these. Okay, how's that?
Yes, it's great.
Best laid plans. All right, so let's get started again, round two. We're really excited about this panel. The COLAS committee has been working on this since January, and we have our esteemed panelists who are really we're celebrating something that is something we as UCSF faculty should be so proud of what we've accomplished. So we'd like to have our audience, please raise your hand if you have questions. We want this to be a dialogue and be lively. Those on the Zoom, please put your questions in through the chat, and we want this again to be a dialogue. But we'll kind of kick it off. Really, we've talked about the policy. Annalise mentioned that, but what were the problems that we were trying to solve here? And why was the open access policy an effective tool to address these problems? And I'm thinking that Rich, you're probably the person to kick this off here.
Sure. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, and so happy to be here. I should tell you that this is just one of my favorite stories about being at UCSF, and it's this epic journey that really is a great example of shared governance and collective action and involvement at pretty much every level of our university, from faculty and students to administrators in the library and administrators in the office of the president. And it really demonstrates how if an institution is aligned, they can accomplish great things. And when I was starting as a faculty member back in 2003, call for service came out, as it does every year, from the Academic Senate, and I went through the list and I saw a library committee, and I thought, okay, that's going to be pretty easy. Here's a good way to demonstrate service and not put in a lot of work. And so I got on the committee, and in 2003, 2004, turns out there was a lot going on in scholarly communications. There was a movement that had just begun in the early 2000s, the open access movement. There were 3 big meetings that had just happened in Budapest and in Berlin and in Bethesda. The Bethesda one, in fact, was what led to NIH policy and PubMed Central. Here at UCSF, we had 2 very prominent faculty, Keith Yamamoto and Peter Walter, who had just decided to help take on Elsevier in 2004 and boycott Elsevier for the way that they were intending to raise our subscription price for the Cell Press titles. We had faculty members like Harold Varmus here at UCSF, people like Mike Eisen at UC Berkeley and Pat Brown at Stanford, who were deciding that the way that the journal publishing world was working was not really sufficient anymore, and they decided to found a journal called PLOS, and PLOS Biology was founded right around that time. So all this stuff was happening in the early 2000s, and I just popped in on library committee and was exposed to it and realized that there was an opportunity for us as an institution to start moving in the direction of transforming scholarly communication. So I went on in 2004, I went to the system-wide committee, which was the Academic Senate System-Wide Committee on Library and Scholarly, and it wasn't Scholarly Communication at the time, it was just System-Wide Committee on Library. And there I encountered the chair, a man who deserves a lot of credit for work in this area. His name was Ben Crow. And Ben Crow is from UC Santa Cruz, and UC Santa Cruz in 2005 passed the first faculty resolution in support of open access publishing. And from that resolution, it was a unanimous resolution signed off by the faculty. And the call was to get the University of California to pass an open access policy that would allow us as faculty authors to make all of our work freely available to the world. And so working on that committee, working on the system-wide library committee, we all began to think about ways that we could develop a policy that would be acceptable to the faculty. And by 2007, we had a policy that was then sent out system-wide for responses from the individual campuses about the support of this policy. I helped write with Karen Butter and others write UCSF's response that Mike Bishop eventually sent in response to the proposed system-wide policy. UCSF was very supportive. There were some concerns that we voiced, but UCSF was one of the campuses that was very strongly in support of a system-wide open access policy. But unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of support elsewhere for some very specific reasons around the burden that was placed on faculty from this policy. In particular, faculty had to submit addenda to their publishing agreements. They had to do all of these other compliance issues. There was a lot of work that faculty had to do in order to participate in this policy. And that burden on the faculty was something that people really felt uncomfortable with. There were issues around copyright and so on and so forth that people had some questions about. So that policy didn't really pass. It didn't get far in 2007. But the world continued to move forward. In 2008, Harvard looked at what the UC experience was. They saw where our policy went awry. In fact, there's a great story about folks who were involved in the Harvard policy saying that more or less what UC's loss was Harvard's gain, and they were able to kind of cleverly turn the policy around and make that burden on faculty much less. They made the policy such that once it was passed, it was more or less a condition of employment, and that authors had to opt out of the policy. Otherwise, they were by default participants in the policy. And Harvard developed this model policy that then more than 100 or so other institutions began to adopt around the world, around the US and elsewhere. And by 2008, 2009, it was pretty clear that we were not going to get a system-wide policy passed. And so I was chairing the system-wide library committee at that point. And realizing this, I came back to UCSF, the local committee, library committee. And in 2011, began to work on a UCSF open access policy that was modeled after the Harvard policy and MIT and elsewhere. And taking into consideration all of the lessons that we had learned from the original UC open access or UC system-wide open access policy. And in particular, the issues around compliance and the issues around the burden to faculty. And I have a slide that, I don't know if we can put that up, that just kind of, I just want to show you what we did specifically in our policy to really help alleviate the concerns of faculty to get this policy passed. So the policy really, all of the open access policies that were passed by institutions have two parts. One is a component that relates to the license, and that we as faculty authors, when we write an article, we retain the rights to that article. We own the copyright. And that is something that UC has established from the beginning of the UC as an institution, that authors, the faculty authors, own their rights. And what we did in these policies was we assigned, or we grant, a limited set of rights from that copyright to the regents. In this case, a non-exclusive license to publish that work, to make that work available. And that's a pre-existing non-exclusive license that we give to the regents prior to submitting an article for publication with a journal. So that when a journal comes along and says, we accept your manuscript, and they ask you to sign a copyright transfer agreement, which is the standard way that we transfer all of our rights to a publisher, there already is in effect a pre-existing rights, set of rights that have been granted to our institution. And so publishers really have to then ask us to waive those rights, or in some cases just hold off on making that article available until a certain period of time elapses. And the second part of the policy is a deposit requirement, where after we assign these rights to the regents, we then can make that article freely available in an institutional repository, which one of the other great parts of this story was the collaboration that we as faculty got to have with colleagues in the library, like Catherine Mitchell, in building an infrastructure to support this policy. Because the other thing that we did at the end of our policy was put in language that was very specific to the UC experience, which was that the faculty calls upon the Academic Senate and the University of California to develop and monitor a system of implementation and compliance that would make the system as convenient for the faculty as possible, right? So that at the end of the day, we as faculty would not have to do more than we normally do as part of our publishing process, so that there's not extra work and extra burden or extra liability or exposure that we would have as authors as part of the policy. And so working with California Digital Library to develop a system to make it as convenient for the faculty as possible was another big part of this story that has made the policy so successful. So that's really all I wanted to say in terms of the history. And I'm happy to take questions as we go forward.
Maybe do we have any questions from the audience right now for Rich related to the history? Do we have any on the chat? No. Okay. And I remember those days, Rich, you were a traveling roadshow going to, I don't know how many meetings, how many academic senate meetings you came in and got us riled up about it. So
yeah, I would just say it. Yeah. I was just going to say that to me, one of the proudest moments of my entire career at UCSF was after spending an entire year going to almost every single Senate committee, all the faculty councils, and then going to have the vote, the Senate vote in HSW on Parnassus, and just trying to corral as many people. Marta remembers.
Yeah. I was just going to say that basically that I remember that. So this was the early times when I was starting to get involved with this. Rich has been involved longer, but I remember that day I was very enthusiastic already about open access. And I remember it was HSW 300. And I remember Rich standing at the door because, one thing that's difficult even for people that care about this is to get them and do what they're supposed to do. They have many other things that they need to work on. So he was standing there at the door of the HSW 300, and as the people lunch hour, and as the people were passing by, he was just like, "This is, you need to go in and you need to sign. It is very important." And I came specifically to sign, but many other people were just sort of grabbed in, and the policy passed unanimously.
Yeah, it was really amazing. There were so many faculty that came into this room to vote on the UCSF policy, and it was. According to the Senate staff, they told us that it was the largest vote on any issue in UCSF history, and it was unanimous. And as I said, it was one of the proudest moments in my career just to see, again, this idea of collective action of all of our colleagues working together to do something that we knew would have tremendous impact. And at the time, we were the largest medical center in the world to pass an open access policy. To make all of our work freely available, and it was really exciting to see.
Yeah, and that's great. But obviously the work went on. Maybe we can hear a little bit more. What was the role of the academic senate in this? Because this is absolutely faculty driven, which is critical, right? Marta, you might want to take that one.
Yes, so I think Rich sort of kind of already highlighted many of those things, but yes, academic senate was absolutely instrumental because faculty are instrumental to these policies. So. It is in faculty's interest to publish their work open access because that's how it reaches more readers. We all want, the reason we do science, the reason we do research, the reason we publish is for people to read it. And to have that work behind paywall, having people not being able to access it is obviously not something we want. But at the same time, the academia, is difficult to move in some ways. There are other things, there are promotions and other things. And so you kind of have to do it in a way that makes sense for people and it works for people. And so having faculty on one hand on board was absolutely critical for any of these policies to succeed, right? Because if the faculty are not going to participate, then the policies are going to fail. Even if they exist, they're not going to work. So therefore, the policies, even though they have to be made, and Rich already talked about that, they have to be created in such a way that the burden is not very high, that the administrative burden on the faculty member is not very high. And so engaging faculty through academic senate, because that is the voice of the faculty governance, was really the key to make that happen. You know, a lot of, what probably all of the faculty are a very independent bunch. They don't like to be told what to do. They like to, you know, be able to choose what they want to do. And so if, you know, if they perceive that the policy was imposed on them from the university administrators or from the libraries, you know, I think then there would have been much greater resistance to it. And through the involvement of academic senate, basically it was possible for faculty to actually get involved, to make policies work for them, you know, and Rich already outlined which, you know, how the policies were actually changed, you know, and that was based on the input of academic senate. So I think that was really instrumental, and we will talk about that probably also later. But as we moved on into the next stage and building, you know, of these transformative agreements, and that's going to be, you know, we're going to talk about that in the later part of this event, but it was again instrumental to have a coalition between the libraries and the faculty and the administration. So, you know, all three parts to kind of work together. And I think that was an important secret to our success.
Maybe both of you could elaborate on the next question, which is what are the key components of our policy, and how does it differ from other open access policies from other institutions?
Sure. If I could, I just wanted to, one thing to follow up on what Marta just said is a huge shout out goes to the Senate staff, who, you know, any policy that gets passed. I remember Todd, who's here, he's our executive director, but back in the day, 2005, Ben Crow and all of us trying to get this. So you have as much history in all of this as anybody, and the Senate staff are the ones who schedule the meetings, get us out in front of the other faculty, co-write the letters, and, you know, they're the grease that, you know, get all the gears turning. And so really, you know, again, this collaboration is it's not just a faculty effort, it's really an institutional effort where we're all thoroughly engaged with a common goal. And it's been, you know, it's exciting because we're accomplishing something. And in this case, you know, our policy, like I said, the lessons that we learned from the 2007, 2008 experience around faculty burden, around the copyright issues, the mistrust that our faculty initially had about assigning anything to the regents. Like, why would I give my rights to the regents? But then again, they had no problem signing their rights over to Elsevier or Wiley or any other publisher. But, you know, the idea that somehow, you know, there was this disconnect. And so trying to convince our faculty authors that, no, you're not transferring your rights to the regents. You're basically just assigning them as a proxy so that we as authors can retain our rights, and, you know, having those conversations. So that was really important. The other big difference is that many of the other open access policies, the authors, the faculty have to ask for permission to opt out of the policy. So in some institutions, if you're an author and you don't want to participate, you don't want to make your article open access, or if a publisher says to you, you know, we won't publish this work if you have an open access copy of it sitting somewhere in an archive, those authors have to then go to a governing entity, a dean, or some administrator and ask for permission. And there would be presumably a delay in that process. Whereas in our policy, what we did was we said, if I'm an author and these are my rights, I can simply say, I want to opt out. I don't have to ask permission. I can just opt out. So an author just has to say, I'm opting out, or I want a waiver, or whatever, without getting permission from the institution. And that was another key difference, and it's still a key difference in our policy from many other institutions. There is no governing office that we have to go to and ask for permission. We have control over the decision that we want to make around whether we want to participate or not participate in the policy.
Marta and Catherine, would you like to elaborate any further?
No, I mean, I think that basically really sums it up, but maybe just one point for the, you know, Senate staff. I mean, this is so true, not only that they, you know, do a lot of the writing of these policies, which is really, and, you know, many of them have law degrees, and they really, you know, actually help us, you know, because they have to be written in a legally appropriate language, right? You know, but also they since they cover many committees, they will, you know, provide, they can be a glue, right? As Rich already said, and they will sort of bring the same issues from one committee to another, and that's really, really helpful.
And I wondered too, Rich, if you might elaborate a little bit about how you got all the faculty committees riled up. You gave examples to us. I remember I was on academic freedom, right? And that was a big issue, where you told us about we're getting the grants, we're doing the work. Maybe share how you, if you remember how you, literally it got everyone angry in that
Yeah, I
meeting.
think so, it was a little trial and error trying to figure out copyright put people to sleep. You start talking about copyright, they're like, blah, blah, blah. It's really hard to understand that. And, personally, I was motivated by the copyright more than anything else. I couldn't believe that we spent so much time getting the grants, writing the papers, doing all the work. And at the end of the day, we would just sign over all of our rights to the publisher. And we had no control over the derivatives of that work. If we wanted to put a graph in a book chapter that we were writing, we had to write to the publisher and get permission and then pay Copyright Clearance Center $500 to get the access to our own work. So that drove me nuts. And it was really something that was motivating me. But for other faculty, by the time you're submitting an article or you publish the article and you get the acceptance letter, you don't care. You've gone through so much. You're like, fine, I'll sign whatever it takes. Let's just get the article out and move on to the next project. So the way that I realized that people were getting the most upset was around the profit margins of the commercial publishers. So Wiley, Elsevier, Springer Nature, those folks were making profits on the order of 35–40% year over year, okay? And that was in comparison to like big tech companies like Apple and Google that were making profits in the 20s or so. The fact that these commercial publishers were taking all of our work, taking our copyright, asking us to edit that work, peer review that work, handle the manuscripts, do everything. And all they did was put the imprint of their journal on it. That was so infuriating to me and to everybody else. And so I would go up there with these big graphs that showed the budget of the library going down year after year after year and all the cuts to journals that we had. And then the opposite line of the profit margins of the commercial publishers and saying, in the life cycle of a scholarly article, here's all the stuff that we do. We calculated in terms of FTE, how much peer review we did as an institution. It was something on the order of like $20 million a year in FTE time that we contribute to the ecosystem of commercial publishing, in addition to the $40 or so million a year that we paid for subscriptions to access the content that we generated ourselves. And so putting those slides up on the board, getting faculty to talk about that. And again, this was in the context of the Elsevier boycott that Keith and Peter had worked on. And then Keith and I had worked on another boycott against Nature when in 2010 or 11 or so, Nature wanted to raise our subscription by 300%, by $1 million in 1 year. And we published 12% of all the content in Nature, right? UC authors had a huge effect on the bottom line for Nature, and there they were wanting to raise our subscription. So just talking about it in terms of economic terms was kind of a way in for me to kind of get people angry and motivated. And then when people would raise serious issues around workflow, around burdens, around academic freedom, we absolutely respected academic freedom. There were conversations where people thought we should not have an opt-out mechanism. This policy would have no teeth at all. If the publishers knew that we could be opted out, we could ask for, if they could ask for a waiver, then every publisher would come along and just push back and say, we want a waiver, we want a waiver. And I know Annalisa sent out, and Karen sent out like 500 letters to publishers once we passed our policy, letting them know we had this policy, because the way the policy was structured is all we had to do was notify the publishers. And if they didn't specifically ask us for a waiver or an embargo, then we were free to make our work instantly available to anyone. And we were confident that based on the experience of MIT and Harvard, that we were going to get very few waivers. They were seeing waiver requests on the order of 5% of total publications. And when we passed this policy, we were seeing about that 4 to 5% authors being asked to waive or sign waivers. And so immediately we felt like, we had something that was successful, and we could talk about that. We could talk about that.
But you were talking about academic freedom, right? And how concerned was that basically without that ability to have the waiver, that the faculty would not be supportive, because, they didn't want to have certain journals be not accessible to them just because we have the open access policy. And even if it's just 5% of the journals, sometimes these are exactly the journals that people want.
Right.
So it was very critical to keep that, despite these concerns about making the policy toothless, right? That the academic freedom was preserved, and so that the faculty member could choose whether to exercise this right or not.
That's right. In fact, there were very few titles that would require waivers. The nature journals was one of them. Until just recently, they were still requiring waivers. But we now have an agreement with Springer Nature that so they no longer are asking us to waive our open access policy. Strangely enough, PNAS was another one that would ask us to sign waivers. We'd sign a waiver, but then they would grant back almost all of our rights. They needed an exclusive license to publish for some reason. But yeah, for the most part, our authors were not getting pushback from the publisher.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, got the policy, right? So you built it, but are people coming? And maybe I think, Catherine, you're the person to address this from the California Digital Library. How were they implemented and how's it played out?
Rich talks loudly enough that it doesn't matter. Okay, so could we put up the slide with the implementation data? Yeah, so from the California Digital Library perspective, we watched this policy development with enormous excitement and some dread because we knew that we were going to have to find a way to implement this policy and to honor the desire for it to be as simple as possible for the faculty to participate in. And so you can see here, and I'm just going to stand up and hopefully I can help you see things because it's a little bit small. So the UCSF Senate open access policy happened here. The very first thing to happen within the UC system on open access, followed by the UC system-wide Senate policy. And more recently, that was 2013. More recently in 2015, the presidential policy that covers all staff. And so you can see here, this this section, the gray, is where we were in terms of collecting authors accepted manuscripts at the point of the adoption of the policy. We didn't have a method for accepting those manuscripts. And so we devised this form where faculty could come and they could put in all the metadata. They could add all the information about their publications. They could fill out 30 different fields, and then they could deposit their paper. And not surprisingly, hardly anyone did that. And so we started to work toward a process that was less onerous and that enabled people to participate in a way that just didn't feel as if the burden was entirely on them. And we launched in 2015 the UC publication management system. And this system, what it has managed to do is basically automate the collection of publication records. So for those of you who are publishing regularly, you're probably getting a little prompt in your email letting you know that we've noticed that you have published. We know that because we're harvesting from indexes where your publications are showing up. And once we see that, we alert you. And we encourage you to come and claim your publication records and deposit your authors accepted manuscripts. And I just want to say, because we have open access royalty, two different versions of open access royalty in our presence, but this is a particularly fun little bit of information. Marta was the first person at UCSF to deposit a manuscript via the UC publication management system. And so, bravo. And you can see that from that moment in which Marta did that, it really just took off in a way that it hadn't here. And it just started to grow. But the other thing that's important to notice here is that at every point at which we've been able to automate further, we've seen an enormous jump. So here we had the UCSF policy batch deposit trial that Annalisa was very deeply involved in, where we were able to batch a bunch of manuscripts and deposit on behalf of the faculty because they had already claimed them. So that was a huge jump. And then we got the Euro PubMed Central auto deposit launch, and then we saw another jump. And the thing that we're learning from all of this is the publication management system isn't enough. We need to find ways to automate the entire process. And the more that we can work with publishers and the more that we can work with other repositories, the more quickly we can start to collect those publications. So I would say that it's been, it's happened in fits and starts. This was definitely an important moment to be able to at least automate the collection of the records. But each time we do an experiment and we try another form of sort of automating, circumventing the faculty entirely, we see a big jump in participation.
Okay, do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit more? How successful would you say we've been, and how are we measuring this?
Yeah, so I was just talking to folks on my team about this today. It is a really, really hard thing to answer. First of all, we have to ask ourselves how we measure success. I don't need to stand up anymore. I can sit down again. Sorry. We have to ask ourselves how we measure success. And, you know, in some quarters, there's been a critique of open access policies based purely on the question of what percentage of total publications are being collected. We have a challenge at UC in that we haven't yet identified exactly the number of total publications we generate. And so because we don't have a denominator, it's hard to know exactly what percentage we're collecting, but it is under 50%, there's no question. And so we haven't succeeded in the sense of collecting every single publication we could have from the, you know, under the policy. But what the policy has done that has been enormously successful for the system is operate within a broader ecosystem in which people are increasingly aware as a result of the policy and discussions around the policy, aware of open access. They're aware of issues with copyright and, you know, protecting their own rights to their intellectual property. And when things have happened, like now we have to walk away from Elsevier because they're not negotiating in a way that's consistent with our values and our expectations, the faculty are primed for that moment and have been ready to support those kinds of actions. So it has really been sort of the canary in the coal mine. It's been the way that we've, you know, sort of measured, or the litmus test is maybe a better example, the way that we've measured faculty comfort and awareness, comfort with and awareness of open access as an option. So in that way, it's been enormously successful. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's also made a huge difference in the world, that people have gotten access to the research coming out of UC and UCSF in ways that they couldn't have, because these are folks who were not affiliated with R1 institutions. They don't have, you know, they don't have a way to subscribe to these journals. And so it's just really broadening access in an enormously important way. So, you know, it all depends on how you measure success.
Thank you for that. Rich, yeah.
I would just add one other detail about, and I completely agree, that deposits are not the only way to measure success. What we did here at UCSF, we acted as a canary in the coal mine for the whole UC system. We passed a policy in 2012. We were able to gauge the way the publishers responded, the way our authors responded, and that was enough to enable the system-wide committee, you know, in a kind of an evidence-based way, to pass a policy at the system-wide level. We were able to go out to the other campuses and say, look, we did this at UCSF. It hasn't affected people's tenure and promotion. It hasn't affected our interactions with commercial publishers. And if anything, it's put authors in a better position to advocate for themselves, and put the publishers on notice that we're no longer going to be at their mercy around in terms of the balance of power around these around our scholarly output. And so in that case, it was a huge success. And so for me personally, it was never about compliance or deposits. It was always about letting the publishers know that we were taking our rights back as authors. And for me also, it was just the first leg of this three-legged stool, which is basically our copyright, the amount of money we pay in subscriptions, and the amount of work that we do in peer review that's not acknowledged. So, you know, we really wanted, and I was not alone in this, there were many faculty in the UC system who wanted to transform scholarly communication more broadly on all these different levels. And this was just a first step in that. And as you know, if we have time to get to, we've continued down this path to do many more things to transform scholarly communication. And the OA policy was just the very first step in that process. And in that regard, I think it was immensely successful.
I think that's a perfect segue into, let's talk about those transformative agreements, and how did the policy lead to those, and what's the role of faculty in the academic senate in actually negotiating those?
Right, so maybe we should just first start with what the transformative agreements are, right? So and Annalisa set that up slightly at the beginning, right? So, but we were talking about the open access policy and the, you know, green open access, right, which is depositing the final author's manuscript. into the repository. And the transformative agreements are now looking at, expanding the open access into the gold open access arena. And hopefully by the end of this today, we'll get to talk a little bit more about diamond open access as well. But to talk about the gold open access side of things, right? So as Catherine mentioned, still there is, you still have to do work. You still have to deposit this manuscript, into, as easy as it's getting, or easier as it's getting. It's still some extra step that all the faculty are very busy. We're all very busy, and so it can be a challenge for people to do. But also, many are not really still aware of the policy as much as many people are, and more people are. Still, some people are not, and so this sort of also delays participation, or diminishes the participation. And finally, it is a little bit nicer to read that typeset version than the manuscript, right? We can probably all encounter that. So there have been a lot of reasons to see whether we can expand this open access and sort of include, just make the paper open access to begin with. So there's not a separate version, there's a version of record, but there's the manuscript and all these different versions floating around. And people having to figure out which version to use. But the key idea there was that, in fact, there is enough money in the system, because libraries, of course, were still paying subscription to these journals, regardless of the fact that these manuscripts are being deposited. And so that if you take system as a whole, there is enough money in the system for everything to be made open access, even if there is this article processing charge, which is the charge that the publishers, not the diamond open access ones, so we'll hopefully get to that. But many, certainly all traditional commercial publishers, charge to make the article open access, and this fee is supposed to cover their various costs around, around publication. So anyway, so the transformative, so with that background, transformative agreements are basically trying to do that, to transform this sort of broader scholarly communication landscape, and to sort of channel this the funds that the libraries are using to pay subscriptions towards open access. But obviously this is not a simple thing to do. And here UC has been, very, very like on the front of these efforts in the world, and our negotiations with Elsevier and willingness to walk away from the deal with Elsevier were part of that. But your question was, how are faculty participating in that, right? Yeah. And so this basically, for that to work, again, sort of same thing as when we talked about open access policies, it was really critical for those initiatives not to be just library driven, not to be driven just by university administration, but to be faculty driven. And in fact, the transformative, the project at UC is called Project Transform. So that's the project to transform the scholarly communication towards open access more broadly. And this project, from the beginning, it's a working group of librarians and faculty, as well as with some, administrative, administrator involvement as well, but primarily librarians and the faculty. And this working group is composed of, those people, but also the actual negotiating team, the people that are conducting actual negotiations are, that smaller group of people is also basically the librarians and the faculty. And so both Rich and I have actually served, Rich is continuing to serve. I have served on that group, 1 year, and on the broader group for 2 years. And this is a very, very intense process. That's definitely, if you're a diehard open access enthusiast, that takes like many, many, many hours. This is not, way beyond depositing your manuscript into, the depository, but it has been an incredibly rewarding, and I think we have achieved a lot, and I will actually let Rich speak about that. But yes, I think the faculty, that this is a partnership between the faculty and the librarians, has been incredibly important. It's important when we negotiate with publishers, and we have had many conversations with faculty and librarians at other institutions in terms of how to establish similar partnerships, because that's what makes them powerful. So maybe you can talk a little bit about things that we have accomplished.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I would say the amount of time spent in negotiations has been tremendous, but the rewards have been immense. We've, spent weeks at times negotiating with publishers like Elsevier or Springer Nature or Wiley to try and get these transformative agreements. In other words, take our subscription spend, which, as I said, is upwards of $40 million at the University of California, and more or less move all of that into paying for open access publishing, so that we no longer have to just contend with this subscription system where any reader, whether it's a patient or a patient advocate or someone in a junior college or a high school student doing a report, no one has to encounter a paywall anymore. That's the goal, is to get rid of subscriptions and really realize the dream of the internet, which is that information is freely available to everyone. And that's, if you think about when open access came around, it started with kind of, the internet and this promise that everything would be available. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish here, is to essentially just destroy the subscription system, which was a legacy of print that had been around forever, and there's no reason for it. And so what we have been doing, in addition to negotiating for our own institution here at UC, is modeling good behavior for other institutions and sponsoring workshops and going out to, spending not just time here negotiating with publishers, but actually going to other faculty senates and talking with them about, our other libraries, talking with them about the power of transformative agreements, essentially taking your subscription spend and using it to pay for open access publishing. And what we hope in the future is that these agreements will more or less go away, and our institutions will simply follow where our authors publish. And so we as authors will make decisions about which journals, which titles are the important ones for our disciplines, and the institution will support that. The funders will support that by following us as authors to wherever we want to publish.
Okay, great. I'm looking at the clock here. I just want to, and Marta, you brought up a good point. I liked it about the diamond access, and I'm hoping, Catherine, you could spend a little time. How does the e-scholarship support the diamond access?
Yeah, so Diamond OA is, as Annalisa explained, another version of publishing in open access from the beginning. And in this version, there aren't associated fees for the author, which doesn't mean that it doesn't cost anything. And that's something that's often critiqued about Diamond OA, the implication that it doesn't have a cost. But of course it does. It just means that the cost does not rest with the author. And so eScholarship, in addition to being the repository where you can deposit your manuscripts under the open access policies, is a Diamond OA publisher. We publish 95 journals. They are all UC affiliated to some degree, which might simply mean that there's a UC faculty member on the editorial board. Many of them are international journals. Most of them are international journals, except the student journals. And these journals, we don't charge a fee to the editors to publish their journals in eScholarship. So they can use the platform. They have a manuscript submission system, peer review management system, and they can publish their journal, and then they have a site for their journal on eScholarship. And one of the things that we feel very strongly about is that Diamond OA has a place in this ecosystem too. It is simply the case that commercial publishers do not adequately serve all disciplines. They don't serve small fields well. They don't serve fields with emerging scholars well. They tend to gravitate toward areas where there is a known audience, where they are likely to make a profit, or at least, find a sustainable path forward for their journal, but generally make a profit. And so we feel strongly that it's important, as part of this sort of multi-pronged, or as we say, the pathways to open access model, that we support the kinds of fields and disciplines and research that have been left behind by the commercial publishers. So eScholarship has really interesting research that comes out of academic units that are affiliated with the campuses. It actually has a lot of multidisciplinary publications that cross disciplines that might not typically be associated. And so it's kind of a funny fit. We also are very interested in issues of equity, because one of the things that the transformative agreements achieve enormously well is they make research open. So there's equity in access to research. But what they don't necessarily do is provide an equitable ability to participate in the publication of that research. If you're at an institution that can't help you pay the APC, if you live in a region of the world where there isn't that kind of institutional funding behind you, you may not be able to publish within the sort of logic of a transformative agreement. And so Diamond OA allows for publication regardless of your situation and the financial circumstances of your institution. So we feel in terms of equity, when we think about equitable open access, it's not simply can the research be accessed, but who's publishing it? Can it be published by anybody who would like to in any region of the world, from any perspective, in any discipline? So Diamond OA is really, really important to UC. It's part of our Pathways approach, and eScholarship is the place where we do that. It is not the case, however, that it's the only place where Diamond OA happens. There are a lot of Diamond OA journals tend to be scholar-led. They are usually don't have anyone involved except the scholars. And if they are able to fund staff, they'll have staff as well. We have interesting issues that we have to grapple with Diamond OA journals. Some of them are labors of love, and some of them become so successful and have such volume that they have to start to build staffing. They have to find a sustainability model. And that's where we start to experiment with different funding models that can help them along as well. And Marta is involved herself in a Diamond OA journal that's called. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Well, yes, I'm a neuropathologist, and there are plenty of commercial journals, but there is, one of my colleagues in Germany who is a well-known neuropathology editor, and I have felt very strongly that we want an open Diamond Access neuropsychology journal. And so we have been, we have started in January 2020, kind of from the ground up. And it's just about to get into PubMed. There are, as you know, a lot of logistical hurdles, and you have to publish for a certain period of time at a certain level of quality for that to be possible. But anyway, yes, it's definitely we need to promote and support open access in all forms, but Diamond Open Access is the way that's closest to my heart. So yes, I think the idea there is that there is no fee to the authors, but also obviously that's what makes it open access, no fee to the reader either, right? And so it's basically supported by academic institutions and essentially recognizes the fact that Rich mentioned many times that we, like the 90% of the work, that's what's infuriating about commercial publishers, right? The 90% of the work is done by the scholars, right? We edit, we peer review, and so there's like that only small step at the end that the publisher does, but they get all the profits. So the idea behind Diamond Open Access is, well, by just, maybe we can do that 10% that they do, and then we can, if we can kind of take care of that part, then we don't need the publisher at all, or at least the commercial publisher at all.
Yeah,
And so, yeah.
It's an opportunity for institutions to take control of the dissemination of the research of their faculty, so that they become the locus of that publishing model. The one other thing I would say about Diamond OA is that it allows folks who are maybe currently editors of commercial journals who are looking for a place to flip their journal. That's the lingo. That's when you have a commercial journal and you want to move it out of that commercial environment and into an open access environment. Institution-based publishing programs are a great place to do that often. And we have recently been the soft landing for a few different journals that have flipped out of Elsevier. And so that's also a great opportunity for the institution to take a stand to support new models.
Yeah, and I think in that case, they had to change, right? When you do that, you probably have to change the name of the journal, right? It's sort of the whole editorial board moved, right, with some of these journals, right?
Yeah, but, depends on, sometimes they own the title, sometimes they don't. And in our case, they had to change the name and engage their community in understanding what has happened. But the editorial board can move. It's just often difficult to keep the name.
Okay, all right. I've been told that my clock monitor is saying that we have questions from the.
We don't have any questions from the Zoom, but it is, we are at 4:05. So I just wanted to be mindful. We also do have a reception. We've got food outside. If we have questions on the room.
Yeah, I want to make sure that, is there anyone from the audience that has any questions? I think if you speak, we want to.
So one of the issues that you talked about in evaluating OA was economic, and I've been out of academic libraries for several years, but I'm wondering what the impact has been on the economics of library budgets and collections. A simple question.
Maybe Chris should answer this.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you, Karen. That was Karen Butter, the former university librarian here at UCSF, who was a colleague in arms with Marta and Rich and so many others. So glad to have her back. And her question was, how has it affected the economics of library budgets? And unfortunately, so far, it's costing us more than it did before, because we are significantly subsidizing many of these agreements, these transformative agreements, which often, in addition to negotiating a lower cost for each article processing charge, we are paying the first $1,000, and for those researchers who don't have, and faculty who don't have the money to publish because their grant ran out or they didn't have a grant in the first place, the library is covering the full cost. And in addition, we're supporting Diamond Open Access. We're supporting annual reviews, which is publishing Diamond Open Access. We're supporting journals like Public Library of Science, which never had a subscription model before. So it's actually costing us a reasonable amount of money. And there are some critiques of the transformative open access agreements around the idea that we're still propping up the commercial publishers. We could have an entire symposium on that topic alone. That said, we are very happy that we have been able to do this in sustainable ways, where our budgets haven't cratered. We're not unable to make this work. And the researchers themselves, through their grants and through their funding from their departments and so forth, are contributing significant amounts as well. And I think that's part of the reason for the success. I mean, this industry, we're shifting the industry. We're hopefully reducing the amount of profits, the obscene profits that some of these publishers were making. But this is not something that's going to ever happen for free. There's always going to be costs associated. And we just have to figure out ways to make sure that we're supporting those in sustainable ways. I don't know if Rich or others want to comment further.
Yeah, I would just say that there are the actual costs, but by not doing something, there was an opportunity cost that would have been lost. And here, what we're trying to do is, fix something while it's moving in the least disruptive way. And so we were already spending all the subscription money. Those costs kept going up year after year after year, and we were not getting the access that we wanted. So in order to put the brakes on that system, we had to do something. And as Chris points out, we're continuing to spend money, but the goal over the long term is that once we've retained copyright, we now control where our money gets spent, how we spend it when we follow our authors. If our authors decide en masse to start moving away from the commercial publishers to lower cost journals, if they want to move their disciplines, then now we have the ability to do that because we have control over the money and we have control over our rights. And so this is part of that three-legged stool that I was talking about, where we're taking apart this industry, but we wanted to do it in a way that was the least disruptive as possible. The hardest part about transforming the whole system was hearing from our authors, well, I have to publish in this journal because I need it for promotion. I have to publish in this journal because I need it to be able to get my grants or recruit students. And so what we did was we came up with a way of allowing our authors to publish in those journals, continue to publish in the canon of literature that they all need to publish in, but to force those publishers of those journals to make those journals open access. And so the only way that we could envision doing that was to either walk away from publishers like Elsevier until they're willing to take our subscription money and use it for open access publishing, or just convincing them by adding a little more money to sweeten the pot that yes, in fact, we're so committed to open access, we're willing to pay for it. But this is a transitional model. Over the long term, what we hope is that we're going to wind up in a world where there are no author-facing fees, where institutions have enough resources to support publishing, where most of academic publishing is done in-house. And so, we have to ask ourselves, if we were to design this system from scratch, would it be where we spend 90% of our effort doing all the work and then sending our paper and our money to someone else to finish it? Or would we just continue that and do that, make up that difference ourselves? And I think if we're re-envisioning scholarly communication, we would do it in a way where we have control of the whole life cycle of the scholarly article.
And I would add, there are numerous examples on this campus and other UC campuses of researchers moving in that direction.
I think there was one more question.
David had a question.
Sure.
Just want to make sure that people at Kane.
I'm David Title, pediatric cardiology, and I was involved with Karen in the library, and
Former chair of the library committee.
yes. And then a really good chair came after me and did all the work. Yeah, exactly. So I was just wondering, in terms of increasing it, it's disturbing that less than 50, you think that less than 50% of manuscripts are actually being uploaded. And I was thinking, it must be a very comprehensive database, and faculty, as Rich says, are not very responsive to external pressure, but they're extraordinarily responsive to peer pressure. And I was wondering if you could have a mechanism when somebody uploads, let's say I have 4 co-authors. I upload an article to eScholarship because we get those emails all the time. If you have a mechanism to then go to the other faculty and say, David Title just uploaded a joint manuscript of yours to eScholarship. This is why it's very good. You have these other manuscripts that you have published that are not uploaded. What do you think about that? And whether I think that could potentially really significantly increase the.
Yeah, I really like the idea of that sort of competitive impulse, you know, sort of harnessing that. I think that would be very complicated for us to do, frankly, just on a technical level. We don't control the technology that we're using. We're using a vendor who's very good at, you know, harvesting the publication data and letting us know who has published, and is very good at then alerting people, and very good at providing a mechanism for deposit. But being able to make those connections with co-authors and then down to, you know, then soliciting from them would be hard. I mean, but you do raise an interesting point, which is, you know, in anything that's co-authored, the burden is much lower because you only need one author to upload it, and then it counts for everyone. You know, keep co-authoring and just make one person do it. I think that we have a much harder time in fields that aren't science-based, where there isn't already a strong culture of open access, and where there is a single author. That's where it becomes really, really difficult. So UCSF is doing very well comparatively. I think that a quarter of all manuscripts that have been deposited under the UC open access policy come from this campus. Even though there are 10 campuses, a quarter of them are, you know, hail from UCSF. So it's not, you know, 75%, 100% of the publications, but we're getting better participation here than on a lot of the campuses.
I would also add, and I think Rich is probably going to say something along these lines, that we would prefer that we don't have to make our authors do this work in the first place.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, some of the best news to come out of Washington, D.C., in my opinion, recently is a memo from the Office of Science and Technology, OSTP, which is that it's a recommendation, but it's pretty clear that the federal agencies are going to implement this, that any federal agency that provides money for research, that any research publication that comes out of that money has to be made immediately available. So when the NIH came out with its open access policy, the publishers were able to water it down to make those articles under an embargo for 1 year, even though most of the institutions were pushing for a compromise of 6 months. The NIH was amenable to the publishers and agreed to a year embargo. But now with this new memo, there will be a 0 embargo period. So that means that anything that receives any federal funding in the form of publication will be made immediately available. So in our case, a place like UCSF, that represents at least half of our publications. Half of our publications are currently in PubMed Central, but they're under a 1 year embargo. So we just really need to worry about this other 50% that's not paid for by federal funding, and get those authors to comply.
And, you know, just to go back to what you were saying, Chris, we ideally we're not getting authors to comply. Ideally, in our negotiations with the publishers around transformative agreements, we are including a clause that requires that they provide us with the author's accepted manuscript so that we can deposit on behalf of the authors. Because, you know, it's just always going to be a point of friction, and there's no reason why we can't go to the source and get the publication and do it on behalf of the faculty. That's where I think we'll make a lot of progress.
I think that's a great way to end our session today. Moving forward, and again, thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your Zoom attendance. And we're going to have a little celebration, it looks like. So thanks again. for sponsoring. So much for the panelists too. Thanks for Pepper, especially for coming over. Oh, yeah.